I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I need your perspective on something that's been weighing heavily on my mind. It's about my wedding day. A day that should have been perfect, but turned into something I never expected. Like many nurses, I'm used to dealing with emergencies and keeping calm under pressure. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for the emotional turmoil that unfolded during what should have been the happiest day of my life. To help you understand how things got so complicated, I should probably start with my family background. Originally, it was just my mom, Diana, my dad, Thomas, and me. Diana was a freelance writer who always encouraged my independence, while Dad worked in real estate development. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable until I turned 16. That's when my parents divorced, and I went to live with my mom. Within a year, Dad married Elizabeth, an art curator who already had two daughters, Claire and her younger sister. 2 years after that, my mom married James, a university professor. I was happy that both my parents had found new partners who made them happy. Elizabeth was genuinely kind at first, and James turned out to be more supportive than I could have imagined. I wish I could tell you we became one big, happy, blended family, but reality had other plans. Don't get me wrong, I truly was happy that my parents found their soulmates. Elizabeth seemed nice enough initially, and James has been incredibly supportive throughout the years. But somehow, I always felt like an outsider in my own family story. Working night shifts in the you see all kinds of family dynamics in crisis. But nothing quite prepared me for how my own family situation would unfold. The changes started subtly after Dad's remarriage. As a kid who grew up in a small, tight-knit family, I'd always believed that the bigger, the better when it came to families. I thought Claire and I might become friends since we were close in age. But despite my attempts to connect, she remained distant and uninterested. I didn't hold it against her. I understood why someone might be hesitant about bonding with their new stepfather's daughter. Dad, however, seemed determined to make Claire feel comfortable around him, which was fine in theory. What I didn't realize then was that his new relationship was developing at the expense of ours. First signs of change. The signs of Dad's shifting priorities were small at first, but they became impossible to ignore. It started with our Friday traditions, the father-daughter ice cream dates we'd had since I was 5, when Dad would listen to my stories about school while we shared a banana split at Joe's Diner. These special moments began happening less frequently, then stopped altogether. When I'd ask about it during my hospital breaks, Dad would brush it off with a casual, "Next week, sweetie, I promise." But next week never came. Then came the bigger moments. My first major case presentation at the hospital. I'd worked months preparing research on emergency trauma protocols. I scanned the hospital auditorium hoping to see him, but his seat remained empty. When I called afterwards, he answered distractedly, explaining that Claire had a crisis with her investment portfolio that needed his immediate attention. This pattern became our new normal. My graduation from nursing school. Dad showed up late, having come straight from Claire's business school networking event. When I got promoted to head nurse, he was too busy helping Claire prepare for her banking interviews to celebrate with me. But the worst moment came during my second year as an nurse. I'd been selected for a prestigious emergency medicine training program in New York, a huge opportunity for my career. The day before I was supposed to fly out, my appendix ruptured. I woke up in my own hospital, in excruciating pain, to find only my mom by my side. Through the fog of post-surgery pain, I asked about Dad. Mom just squeezed my hand and said something had come up. I was devastated. What could be more important than being there for your daughter after emergency surgery? The dinner revelation. I got my answer a month later. Dad insisted that Mom and I should come to dinner at his place for old times' sake, especially since I'd been avoiding his calls since my surgery. When we arrived, we found it wasn't just going to be the three of us. Elizabeth and her daughters were there too. I'll be honest, after everything that had happened, seeing Claire in her designer dress, casually checking her investment apps while sitting in my childhood home, stirred up some complicated feelings. Here she was, fresh from her Wall Street job, while I was still paying off my nursing school loans. But I tried to keep my emotions in check and stay professional, just like I do during difficult shifts in the year. The confrontation. That facade of civility crumbled when Dad had the audacity to criticize me for not responding to his calls and texts over the past month. My nursing instincts usually help me stay calm in tense situations, but this was different. I reminded him that I had been recovering from emergency surgery, a surgery he couldn't be bothered to show up for. His response? He had been busy dealing with other things. And then I learned what was so important, that he couldn't visit his daughter in the hospital. Claire had broken up with her investment banker boyfriend that day and was having what Dad called an emotional crisis. That was the last straw. Years of working in the had taught me about real crises, life and death situations that required immediate attention. To hear my own father equate his stepdaughter's breakup with his daughter's emergency surgery. I left that dinner without finishing my meal. Time passes. After that dinner, I threw myself into my work at the hospital. The became my sanctuary, a place where my skills and dedication actually mattered. I managed to secure another training opportunity and couldn't go home for a long time. That meant zero conversations with Dad. As the years passed, the distance between us grew. Our rare conversations became shorter and more superficial, like those awkward exchanges with patients' distant relatives in the waiting room. Meanwhile, Dad's relationship with Claire flourished. He attended every one of her investment banking milestones, cheering her on from the sidelines. When she made junior partner at her firm, he threw her an extravagant party at a rooftop restaurant. I found out about it on Facebook while taking my break between emergency cases. All of this just made me question what I had done to be pushed to the sidelines of my own father's life. Meeting Stan. But life has a way of balancing things out. During a particularly hectic shift in the I met Stan, a pediatric surgeon. What started as a consultation over a young patient's case turned into coffee in the hospital cafeteria, which led to real dates outside of work. Stan was different. He understood the demands of my job, the emotional toll of working in emergency medicine. We graduated to attending positions together, and when he proposed in the hospital garden, where we'd had our first real conversation, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Finally, I was building a life where I wasn't just someone's afterthought. The wedding plans. Mom was ecstatic about my engagement, of course. She immediately transformed from a freelance writer into a full-time wedding planner, offering to help with every detail between her writing assignments. But when I called Dad to share what should have been one of the biggest moments of my life, his reaction was painfully lukewarm. He was distracted during our call, and before he could make another excuse about needing to be somewhere else, I ended the conversation. Even after years in the dealing with life's unexpected turns, it still hurt that my father couldn't give me 5 minutes of his undivided attention. After careful planning and countless meetings during my breaks between shifts, Stan and I set our wedding date for 5 months later. We sent out save-the-date cards to all our relatives, and most of them RSVP'd, including Dad and his family. But I had kept one detail secret from Dad. Despite everything, I still wanted him to walk me down the aisle. You see, as a nurse, I've witnessed countless family reconciliations in the hospital. Sometimes it takes a significant life event to bring people together. I hoped my wedding day might be our chance to reconnect, to heal some of the wounds that had festered over the years. So I planned to surprise him with this request a month before the big day. The devastating news. I made the call during my lunch break at the hospital, starting with casual conversation about how he was doing. His response stopped me in my tracks. He was over the moon because his daughters were getting married. The word daughters made me pause. I thought I had misheard him through the hospital's poor reception. When I asked him to clarify, what he said next felt like a punch to the gut, worse than any emergency room crisis I'd handled. Claire was also getting married, on the exact same day as my wedding. I stood there in the hospital break room, completely stunned. How could my own father be okay with this? And why would Claire choose this specific date when she knew I was getting married then? I had selected the date 5 months in advance, working around hospital schedules and Stan's surgical rotations. Somehow, Claire had also felt the need to get married on that particular day. The bitter realization. I'll be honest, while I'd felt jealous of Claire during my confused teenage years, I'd never blamed her directly for anything. But at that moment, standing in that sterile break room with my coffee getting cold, everything clicked into place. All these years, it felt like she had been deliberately trying to overshadow every significant moment in my life, monopolizing Dad's attention. I asked Dad if he was really okay with having 2 weddings on the same date, and his response was typical. Claire had met the love of her life a month ago and couldn't wait to get married, and as her dad, he needed to be supportive. Trying to push aside my growing frustration, I brought up the real reason for my call. I wanted him to walk me down the aisle. But then came the next blow. Claire had already asked him to walk her down the aisle, and he had agreed. The familiar feeling of rage bubbled up inside me, the kind I usually have to suppress during difficult shifts at the ER. Why was she doing this? I had never done anything to hurt Claire. I'd always tried to be nice to her. But clearly, those feelings weren't mutual. What hurt even more was how casual my father was about all of this. He thought he could just drop another meaningless sorry, and everything would be fine, just like all those times he'd missed my hospital events. Dad, I said, my voice steady, like when I have to deliver difficult news to patients' families. I'm done with this disappointing back and forth. I hope this is the last time we ever talk. Before he could respond with another excuse, I hung up and went back to my patients. At least in the I knew where I stood. The wedding day preparations. When my wedding day arrived, I had accepted that Dad and some other relatives wouldn't be there since Claire had invited many of them to her wedding too. Working in emergency medicine had taught me to adapt to unexpected situations, so I was determined to make the best of it with the family and friends who chose to be there. James, my stepdad, learned about what happened with Dad, and he offered to walk me down the aisle. Despite our limited time together during my college years, he had always shown genuine interest in my life and career, regularly checking in about my work at the hospital. His offer meant more to me than he probably realized. The unexpected arrival. Then came the actual wedding day. I was excited but nervous, the kind of anticipation I usually feel before a challenging surgery. Thanks to Mom and James' careful planning, everything was running smoothly. But about 2 hours before the ceremony, while I was getting ready with my bridesmaids, many of them fellow nurses from the Dad appeared out of nowhere. I was in the middle of helping my best friend Sarah, an ICU nurse, adjust her dress when Dad demanded to speak with me. Despite my irritation, years of dealing with difficult situations in the had taught me to at least hear people out. As soon as he entered the bridal suite, he rushed to hug me, showering me with compliments. But I could tell there was more to this surprise visit. When I asked him to get to the point, he dropped another bombshell. Apparently, at the last minute, Claire had decided she wanted her biological father to walk her down the aisle instead. When Dad tried to argue about her last-minute changes, Claire had apparently made a cutting remark about how he should feel lucky to still be invited to her wedding at all. Dad, being Dad, started listing everything he'd done for her over the years, but Claire wasn't having any of it. She wanted him gone immediately, saying she didn't want any drama at her wedding. The moment of reckoning. Standing there in my wedding dress, surrounded by the women who'd supported me through countless hospital shifts and personal struggles. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of me felt sorry for Dad. He'd given everything to Claire, and now she was pushing him aside on her wedding day. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being overlooked in the waiting room while he attended Claire's events, felt a twist of satisfaction. He was finally experiencing what it felt like to be dismissed by someone he cared about. Still, my medical training had taught me about compassion, even in difficult situations. I told Dad he was welcome to attend my wedding and that we'd always have a place for him. His face instantly brightened, and he said he was happy he could still walk his daughter down the aisle. I felt my whole body tense up, like when a critical trauma case comes through the doors. Where had he gotten that idea? I explained, as calmly as I could, that while he was welcome at the ceremony and reception, James would be walking me down the aisle. We had already planned it that way. The confrontation escalates. He definitely didn't take it well. Just like when a patient receives unexpected news, Dad's reaction was immediate and volatile. He jumped up and started shouting, demanding to know why James would do that when he was here. The calm, controlled atmosphere of the bridal suite shattered like a dropped medical tray. I tried to use my professional de-escalation skills, asking him to calm down so we could discuss this like adults, but he was beyond reasoning. Dad started guilt-tripping me, claiming that both of his daughters were erasing him from their lives. On any other day, I might have lost my composure and listed every single time he'd failed to be there for me, every missed emergency, every forgotten milestone. But today was my wedding day, and like in the I needed to maintain my composure. Dad had other plans. He stormed out of the room, shouting James' name through the hallways like an agitated patient. Before I could react, James heard the commotion and came to investigate. The moment he stepped into the room, my father lunged at him. Security rushed in. Thankfully, we had them on standby, just like at the hospital, and pulled the two men apart. Stan, who had been checking on the preparations, stepped in and directed the guards to escort Dad out. The aftermath. I stood there in my wedding dress, feeling the same kind of numbness that comes after a particularly difficult shift. The one day that was supposed to be about celebrating love with my chosen family had been disrupted by the same old drama. My bridesmaids, used to handling crises themselves, immediately switched into support mode. Stan, showing the same steadiness he displays in pediatric surgery, offered to postpone if I wasn't feeling up to it. But we had invested too much in this day, emotionally and financially, to let it go to waste. Like after a challenging case in the we regrouped and moved forward. An hour later, we were married, and the reception was everything we'd hoped for. Even though the ceremony went smoothly, I felt slightly disconnected throughout the day, like when you're running on autopilot during a long night shift. But we made the best of it. At the end of the day, what mattered most was that I was married to someone who truly understood and supported me. The coffee shop meeting. A few weeks after the wedding, I decided to meet up with Dad. Part of me wanted closure, like when you need to follow up with a patient after a difficult case. The other part hoped we could salvage something from our shattered relationship. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop during one of my rare free mornings. The moment I saw him, my medical instincts told me this wasn't going to be a smooth consultation. His first words should have been, "I'm sorry," but instead he said, "Can you be a little quick, honey? Something urgent has come up." After years of hearing similar excuses, I was prepared for this. I started professionally, like delivering a difficult diagnosis, laying out all the facts. I told him I was done with his behavior, and he needed to understand the full impact of his actions. I explained how unfair it was that he didn't protest Claire scheduling her wedding on my date, and how hurt I felt by his consistent prioritization of her over me. Your scene at my wedding forced me to put on a brave face for everyone, I said, using the same direct tone I use when explaining serious complications to patients' families. Do you understand how that felt? To have to pretend everything was fine on what should have been the happiest day of my life. He listened quietly, which was surprising. Usually, he'd interrupt with excuses like he did during my hospital events. But as soon as I finished, he launched into what we in medicine call a defensive response. He talked about how hard it was juggling two families, how he tried his best to be there for everyone, and how unappreciated he felt. Then came the most telling part. He suggested I was being too harsh, and that I should consider how difficult things were for him and Claire, especially after her last-minute decision about her biological father. The final realization. Standing there in that coffee shop, I felt the same clarity I get when finally diagnosing a complicated case. It was like he had completely missed the point of our conversation. He even suggested that I might have overreacted to the whole situation, implying that my wedding wasn't the only important event that day. I sat there stunned, feeling the same kind of disbelief I experience when a patient refuses life-saving treatment. It was like all my words had bounced off an invisible wall. My feelings were apparently less valid because he was having difficulty managing his commitments. I left that meeting feeling more confused and hurt than after any difficult shift at the hospital. Family gathering incident. Weeks passed, and I unexpectedly ran into Dad at a family gathering during one of my rare weekends off. Despite my professional instincts telling me to avoid conflict, I decided to stay and maintain civility. Unfortunately, like a patient's condition suddenly deteriorating, the situation quickly became uncomfortable. As the event progressed, Dad started making pointed comments about traditional family values, the kind of passive-aggressive behavior I often see from family members in the waiting room. He particularly focused on how unfortunate it was that I had chosen some random man to walk me down the aisle instead of him. His words twisted the truth like inaccurate medical histories, implying I had deliberately ruined a special family moment. Throughout the gathering, Dad continued his behavior, making remarks that minimized my experiences and decisions. As a nurse, I'm trained to recognize patterns, and his were classic, consistently returning to sensitive subjects despite my attempts to steer the conversation elsewhere. It became increasingly clear that he was more interested in defending his perspective than understanding mine. The revelation. Recently, during a quick lunch break between shifts, I caught up with a cousin who had attended Claire's wedding. What she told me left me as shocked as when we discover an unexpected diagnosis. Apparently, Claire had been quite open about her choice of wedding date, revealing that she had deliberately selected the same date as mine. This wasn't a coincidence or oversight. In Claire's own words, it was a power move. According to my cousin, Claire openly bragged about this decision at her wedding. She told guests that choosing the same date was her way of asserting her place in the family. She wanted to ensure that everyone would remember her big day, even if it meant overshadowing mine. She also spread stories about how I was always jealous of her and would argue with Dad and Elizabeth about her, stories that couldn't be further from the truth. The final update. After a particularly long shift in the last week, I made one of the most important decisions of my life. With Stan's support, I arranged to meet Dad at his place. Like preparing for a difficult procedure, I went in with a clear plan. The conversation was intense, lasting hours, longer than any trauma surgery I've assisted with. This time, I didn't wait to hear his excuses. Years of working in emergency medicine had taught me when to act decisively. And this was one of those moments. I've decided to go no contact with Claire, and I made this clear to Dad. It's like setting firm boundaries with difficult patients. Sometimes it's the only way forward. I won't be attending any family events where she's present. Some family members might believe her version of events, but just like in the I've learned you can't save everyone. Sometimes you have to focus on what you can control. Moving forward, I'm focusing on building a life with Stan and the people who genuinely care about me. Like recovering from a major surgery, healing takes time. But I'm surrounded by the right support system now. Between my shifts at the hospital, I've started reaching out to old friends and even joined a local book club. Small steps toward building a healthier life.